In October 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, an officer in the French Army General Staff, was arrested in Paris on suspicion of treason. Within 2 months, he would be convicted by a secret court-martial, publicly degraded before a crowd in the courtyard of the École Militaire, and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. The case would divide France for more than a decade and alter the relationship between military authority, justice, and the press. Alfred Dreyfus was born in 1859 in Mulhouse, Alsace, a region that had come under German control after the Franco-Prussian War. His family, Jewish and industrial in background, chose French nationality. Following annexation, Dreyfus pursued a military career and graduated from the prestigious École Polytechnique before entering the artillery branch. By 1894, he had secured a position on the General Staff, a post typically reserved for officers considered capable and loyal. The investigation began with the discovery of a handwritten memorandum, later known as the bordereau, found in a wastebasket at the German embassy in Paris. French intelligence intercepted the document, which offered to transmit confidential military information to Germany. The identity of the author was unknown. Suspicion quickly focused on Dreyfus, in part due to handwriting comparisons and in part due to internal biases within military circles. Handwriting experts provided conflicting opinions. Some asserted similarity between Dreyfus's script and the bordereau. Others expressed doubt. Despite the lack of consensus, the General Staff proceeded with charges. On the 15th October 1894, Dreyfus was summoned under pretext and confronted with the accusation. He denied wrongdoing. The subsequent court-martial was conducted in secret. Crucially, judges were shown a dossier of evidence not disclosed to the defense. This file included documents later proven unrelated or improperly attributed. The defense was therefore unable to contest material that influenced the verdict. On 22 December 1894, Dreyfus was convicted of treason. The sentence was degradation and deportation for life. On 5 January 1895, in a public ceremony, his insignia were stripped and his sword broken. Observers reported hostile cries from the assembled crowd. The event symbolized the army's determination to demonstrate internal discipline. Dreyfus was transported to Devil's Island in French Guiana in April 1895. The conditions were severe. He was confined in isolation, monitored continuously, and denied regular communication. Meanwhile, in France, the case appeared settled. Official statements affirmed the integrity of the court-martial, yet doubts began to emerge within military intelligence. In 1896, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, newly appointed head of the Statistical Section, Military Intelligence, reviewed intercepted correspondence and identified similarities between the bordereau and the handwriting of another officer, Major Ferdinand Walgin Esterhazy. Picquart concluded that Esterhazy, not Dreyfus, was the likely author. When Picquart raised his findings, he encountered resistance. Senior officers feared institutional embarrassment and the undermining of the 1894 verdict. Rather than reopening the case, Picquart was reassigned to a post in Tunisia. Esterhazy remained in service. By 1897, information suggesting miscarriage had reached members of the public, including Dreyfus's brother, Mathieu Dreyfus, who began campaigning for review. The press took increasing interest. Newspapers aligned along political and ideological lines. The case evolved from a military proceeding into a national controversy. Anti-Semitic sentiment played a visible role in public reaction. Certain publications framed Dreyfus's Jewish background as implicit evidence of disloyalty. Others condemned such rhetoric as prejudicial. The affair became a focal point for debates over Republican values, nationalism, and civil rights. In January 1898, the writer Émile Zola published an open letter titled "Je" in the newspaper L'Aurore. Addressed to the President of the Republic, the letter accused military authorities of wrongful conviction and deliberate suppression of evidence. Zola's intervention intensified polarization. He was prosecuted for libel and convicted, further amplifying public scrutiny. By the close of the 1890s, France was divided into two camps: the Dreyfusards, who demanded revision of the trial, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who defended the army's authority and the original verdict. Political leaders, clergy, journalists, and intellectuals took sides. The Dreyfus affair had begun as a court-martial. It was becoming a national reckoning. By 1897, the Dreyfus case had moved beyond the confines of military justice and into the broader arena of public debate. The shift began within the army itself. Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, having identified handwriting similarities between the bordereau and Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, submitted his findings to superiors. Rather than prompting a reinvestigation, his report triggered resistance. Senior officials within the General Staff regarded reopening the case as a threat to institutional authority. The army, still sensitive to its standing after the Franco-Prussian War, considered public doubt a matter of national stability. Picquart's conclusions were therefore treated not as corrective insight, but as administrative risk. In response, Picquart was transferred away from Paris in 1896 and later detained on charges unrelated to the affair. Meanwhile, Esterhazy continued in service. Evidence linking him to the bordereau was not formally acknowledged. By late 1897, Mathieu Dreyfus intensified his campaign for review. He publicly named Esterhazy as the likely author of the memorandum. This accusation compelled military authorities to address the matter. Esterhazy was brought before a court-martial in January 1898. The proceedings were conducted rapidly. Evidence presented by the prosecution against Esterhazy was limited. After brief deliberation, the military tribunal acquitted him. The verdict was met with approval among anti-Dreyfusard factions and with dismay among those advocating revision. The acquittal deepened suspicion among critics. Questions arose regarding the integrity of the original evidence against Dreyfus and the apparent reluctance to scrutinize Esterhazy thoroughly. The affair now involved not only an alleged wrongful conviction, but also allegations of institutional protection. Amid these developments, Émile Zola intervened publicly. On 13 January 1898, his open letter Accuse was published on the front page of L'Ara. Zola addressed the President of the Republic, Félix Faure, accusing military authorities of knowingly convicting an innocent man and suppressing exculpatory evidence. The letter named specific officers and alleged deliberate wrongdoing. Its publication marked a decisive escalation. Zola's accusations were framed not as private complaint, but as national indictment. The government responded by prosecuting Zola for criminal libel. His trial in February 1898 became another stage in the affair. During proceedings, defense counsel attempted to reintroduce evidence relating to Dreyfus's innocence. The court limited the scope of argument to whether Zola had defamed named individuals. He was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment and fine. To avoid incarceration, he left France temporarily. The prosecution of Zola did not resolve the controversy. It broadened it. Intellectuals, journalists, and political figures aligned publicly for or against revision. Newspapers across France adopted partisan positions. Demonstrations occurred in Paris and provincial cities. The affair's political dimensions became increasingly explicit. Anti-Dreyfusards framed the issue as defense of army honor and national unity. Dreyfusards argued that justice and republican principles required re-examination of the verdict. Within the military intelligence section, further irregularities surfaced. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Joseph Henry, another officer involved in the original investigation, was implicated in fabricating a document intended to strengthen the case against Dreyfus. The revelation emerged in 1898 during renewed scrutiny. When confronted, Henry admitted forging evidence. He was arrested and subsequently died in prison under circumstances reported as suicide. The exposure of forgery significantly altered public perception. The notion that evidence had been manufactured undermined confidence in the original conviction. The government established a Court of Cassation review to examine the validity of the 1894 court-martial. This review was conducted with greater procedural transparency than the original proceedings. It assessed the secret dossier and the role of forged material. By 1899, institutional pressure made continued resistance untenable. The Court of Cassation annulled the 1894 conviction and ordered a retrial before a new court-martial in Rennes. The Dreyfus affair had thus entered a new phase. What began as a military prosecution had become a constitutional crisis involving the judiciary, executive authority, and the press. Allegations of anti-Semitic prejudice had intensified divisions. Political alignments hardened. France was no longer debating solely the guilt or innocence of one officer. It was confronting broader questions about transparency, due process, and the limits of military secrecy. The retrial would determine whether the annulment of the first conviction would lead to exoneration, or whether institutional inertia would persist. The Court of Cassation's decision in June 1899 annulled the 1894 conviction of Alfred Dreyfus and ordered a retrial before a new court-martial. The venue was set in Rennes, in Brittany. By this stage, the Dreyfus affair had moved beyond military proceedings into a defining political crisis of the French Third Republic. Dreyfus was returned from Devil's Island in June 1899 to face the new trial. Years of isolation had taken a physical toll, yet he maintained his innocence consistently. The retrial began on 7 August 1899 under intense national and international attention. Journalists from across Europe attended. The central question before the Rennes court-martial was whether the original verdict had been unsafe in light of the forged evidence and revelations concerning Major Ferdinand Walsh in Esterhazy. The annulment by the Court of Cassation did not equate to acquittal. It required the military court to reconsider the case. Prosecution arguments continued to rely upon the alleged handwriting similarity between Dreyfus and the bordereau. They also invoked claims regarding motive and opportunity within the general staff. Defense counsel challenged these assertions directly, emphasizing the exposure of fabricated documents and the discrediting of earlier testimony. The revelation that Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Joseph Henry had forged evidence cast a substantial shadow over the prosecution. Defense lawyers argued that any conviction resting upon a tainted dossier lacked legitimacy. They maintained that institutional reluctance to admit error had prolonged injustice. Public tension accompanied the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, supporters and opponents demonstrated. The affair had come to symbolize competing visions of France: republican legality versus deference to military authority. On 9 September 1899, after deliberation, the court-martial delivered its verdict. Dreyfus was again found guilty of treason, this time with extenuating circumstances. The phrase introduced ambiguity. While the sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to 10 years detention, the essential finding of guilt remained. The verdict shocked many observers. The exposure of forgery and the annulment of the first conviction had led numerous commentators to anticipate acquittal. Instead, the retrial reinforced perceptions that institutional loyalty had outweighed evidentiary reconsideration. Political leaders now faced a practical dilemma. Continued imprisonment risked perpetuating division. The government sought resolution. On 19 September 1899, President Émile Zola granted Dreyfus a pardon. The pardon secured his immediate release from custody. However, it did not constitute exoneration. The conviction technically remained, though the sentence was remitted. Dreyfus accepted the pardon. His decision was pragmatic rather than declaratory. Years of imprisonment had taken their toll, and immediate freedom offered relief from further detention. Yet, acceptance of clemency did not equate to admission of guilt. The legal status of his conviction remained contested. The political resolution through pardon reflected broader instability within the French government. The affair had provoked ministerial crises, parliamentary disputes, and electoral consequences. Anti-Semitic agitation had intensified during peak phases of the controversy. Conversely, Republican and liberal factions had mobilized around principles of due process. Following the pardon, advocacy for full rehabilitation continued. Dreyfus and his supporters pursued judicial revision aimed at complete annulment of the conviction. The affair had demonstrated that executive intervention could mitigate punishment, but it could not erase the legal stain of treason. In 1903, renewed legal review began under the authority of the Court of Cassation. This process examined not only forged documents, but also procedural irregularities and the broader evidentiary basis of the conviction. The Rennes retrial thus marked neither conclusion nor vindication. It illustrated the persistence of institutional resistance even after exposure of fabrication. It also demonstrated the limits of partial remedies. A pardon alleviated immediate injustice, but left unresolved the question of legal innocence. The structural confrontation in this phase centered on authority, military autonomy versus judicial oversight, political expediency versus legal rectification. France had avoided indefinite imprisonment of Dreyfus, but the deeper question of wrongful conviction remained. After the presidential pardon of 1899, Alfred Dreyfus remained legally convicted despite his release from detention. The distinction between clemency and exoneration was central. A pardon mitigated punishment. It did not overturn judgment. For Dreyfus and his supporters, rehabilitation required judicial revision. In 1903, new proceedings were initiated before the Court of Cassation. This review was broader and more methodical than prior examinations. The court scrutinized the entirety of the evidence presented during both the 1894 and 1899 trials, including the secret dossier and documents later exposed as forgeries. The investigation confirmed that key elements of the original prosecution had been fabricated or improperly attributed. The forged memorandum created by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Joseph Henry, previously admitted, was re-evaluated alongside other materials. The court also reassessed the reliability of handwriting comparisons and the procedural fairness of the secret court-martial. On 12 July 1906, the Court of Cassation delivered its final ruling. It quashed the 1899 conviction without ordering a further retrial. The judgment declared Dreyfus innocent and voided the earlier decisions in their entirety. For the first time since his arrest in 1894, Alfred Dreyfus stood legally exonerated. Shortly thereafter, he was reinstated into the French army with the rank of major. The reinstatement was symbolic as well as practical. It acknowledged not only personal innocence but institutional error. Later in 1906, Dreyfus was appointed a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. The rehabilitation marked the formal conclusion of the affair in judicial terms. Yet its political and social consequences endured. The Dreyfus affair reshaped public discourse in France. It strengthened the role of the press in political oversight and intensified debate about civil liberties. The division between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards had cut across class, religion, and party lines. The affair accelerated secular republican reforms, including legislation reducing clerical influence in public institutions. Anti-Semitism, visible throughout the controversy, was exposed as a destabilizing force within national life. Public campaigns had invoked religious and ethnic prejudice as arguments against Dreyfus. The eventual exoneration did not erase those divisions, but clarified their impact on the initial proceedings. Institutionally, the affair prompted reconsideration of military justice procedures. The use of secret evidence not disclosed to the defense became a cautionary example. greater emphasis was placed on transparency and judicial oversight in subsequent reforms. The role of intellectuals also emerged as a defining element of the affair's legacy. Émile Zola's Accuse had demonstrated the capacity of public writing to influence legal reconsideration. The term intellectual entered French political vocabulary during this period, describing writers and scholars who intervened in public controversy. Alfred Dreyfus resumed military service and later served during the First World War. He died in 1935. His personal conduct during and after the affair remained consistent. He denied guilt from the outset and sought restoration through lawful means rather than political agitation. The Dreyfus affair extended beyond the fate of one officer. It became a case study in the interaction between nationalism, prejudice, secrecy, and justice. It revealed how institutional loyalty can impede correction of error, and how sustained scrutiny can ultimately compel revision. By 1906, the legal question was settled. The courts had annulled the conviction and affirmed innocence. Political passions gradually subsided, though memory of the division persisted. In retrospect, the affair illustrates the fragility of due process when transparency is compromised. It also demonstrates the capacity of legal systems to correct themselves, albeit slowly and under pressure. Some cases conclude with verdict and fade from record. Others reshape the institutions that judge them. The Dreyfus affair belongs to the latter category. What began in October 1894 as an arrest within the French General Staff evolved into a national reckoning over justice, prejudice, and authority. The official record now reflects exoneration. The historical record reflects exoneration. Together, they form one of the defining legal episodes of modern France.